I'm going to go ahead and introduce each one of you, and can you give a little bit of background on how you came to be involved with InDesign Server? Max?
Sure. So in the 1990s, we worked in database publishing and web to print using technologies that were not Adobe-based, such as iVision. And in 2000, Alyssa and I founded this company to do database publishing, and we landed on a tool called InDesign Desktop 1.0 and started to automate it as the basis for this company. We begged Adobe for a server for 5 long years and finally got our server in 2005. Oli will also say his side of that story.
Excellent. Okay, we've also got Brett Kisner, who's part of Silicon Publishing's team. Say hello to everyone, Brett.
Hi, everybody. So I first got involved with InDesign Server through my work at a editorial, a textbook publishing company, and was first involved in moving them from Quark Express to InDesign, training a couple thousand people around the globe on InDesign and then InCopy. And then InDesign Server came out and made it possible to start automating things at a much finer degree, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later.
Excellent, and we're very excited to have Adobe's own Mike Zahorik. Mike.
Hi, everybody. I am the business development manager supporting InDesign Server, InDesign family products, and I work closely with solutions partners like Silicon Publishing.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Oli Kavern.
I worked in the Adobe Developer Technologies group on InDesign before it, starting in 1998, 1999, before it shipped. I was the scripting guy. I did the scripting documentation. I wrote example scripts. I evangelized scripting, and got to help design the object model itself. So that's it for me.
All right. And I got to get involved with InDesign back when I think we were at 1.0 or 2.0 and we were starting to develop out InCopy. So that was an exciting part of the Adobe days. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Max, do you have your slides ready?
All right. So first, we're going to have an introduction from Mike from Adobe, explain InDesign Server from a sort of high-level Adobe perspective. Then we'll look at what Adobe InDesign Server is, why it was created, how it came to exist, and we'll really focus on how it's used today. I think that's the most important thing to understand. So we'll sort of breeze through the beginnings and get to that. And I'll show you a variety of ways that InDesign Server is used. Then we'll talk basically about how to automate it, how to deploy and scale it, how you can try it, and how you can purchase it. And finally, we'll have ample time for questions and answers, I hope. So to start with, Mike was going to say a few words on behalf of Adobe and their perspective on this product, since it's their product. Mike, are you there?
Yes. Why don't you go to the next slide? Great. All right, so I have been with Adobe really since the creation of InDesign Server. I was very involved with the launch of the product back in 2005. I've been in different roles, but one of the things that's been really good to see is how the market has expanded and how many different types of companies are using this product. When we first started, we really did start in the media space. So companies like Condé Nast and Axel Springer were some of the earlier customers, but since then, many other brands are using the product today. So let's just look at a little bit more information from the business side. Some of the benefits of InDesign Server we'll hear a lot about today is the ability to process files automatically. And I think that links to freeing up your designers. We hear this pretty frequently, that the designer is often the bottleneck in production. InDesign Server allows you to take many of the tasks and automate them. And then also to scale production, to be able to run multiple processes in parallel, run on multiple servers. And it's all on a proven platform. So we do use the same engine as InDesign Desktop. And we generally ship about 30 days after. And in fact, today is the day we announced shipment of the version compatible with the recent desktop release. So under the hood, it's version 15.0. Sometimes you'll hear people call it CC 2020, but that just shipped today. So last point is about ROI. So I think there is a lot of room to automate and improve efficiencies in your workflows. But even more so, if you can bring your print production process closer to your overall marketing campaigns. I think print campaigns that are timely and targeted, personalized, have a very high impact. So let's just look at the technical bits on the next slide. So InDesign Server is really, it's just a headless engine for InDesign. It doesn't come with much. It was really created for developers. And that's why I'm here today to support Silicon Publishing, who is a great solutions developer. But what this is all running on is a 64-bit engine that runs on Win and Mac server platforms. I already mentioned it's got the same code base. The scalability is achieved through multiple processes. It is not a multi-threaded application. And then, as I mentioned, there's no built-in user interface to the product. That's actually part of the flexibility is you can create whatever interface, whatever level of controls you would like, or even better is to work with a partner like Silicon Publishing who can customize the experience for you. And this is all achieved through a combination of C++ plugins, typically JavaScript scripting, and then using SOAP to pass the stuff back and forth, and typically writing against the InDesign markup language, which is the XML description of an InDesign file. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Max and team to tell you more about the solutions and the technology. Thank you.
So that's Mike's take on what InDesign Server is. We have our own perspective, and I'm going to talk about it from different angles and not really dwell on it. But like he said, it's a headless version of InDesign. And what we love about it is that it lives and breathes the formats that InDesign does, both in terms of ingesting InDesign templates or InDesign snippets, and also rendering out the graphic formats and the perfect PDFs that InDesign renders. You know, it also plays nicely with reference assets such as PSD or native AI, and it can render those into high-quality PDF without any errors. So it really has some of the InDesign, some of the Illustrator code in it, and some of the Photoshop code in it to render those things. You can turn on and off Photoshop layers within it. We don't really see a reason to use another tool for making documents these days. Also, InDesign Server, it's important to note, is automated exactly like the desktop is, and the desktop is the ideal debugging tool for it. You can really think of it as the desktop and the server sharing a common engine. So we have a graphics engine inside of there that is the InDesign engine for rendering graphics, vector art, raster images, transparency effects. All of the composition capabilities are identical, literally the same code base. And the automation techniques are also identical. So the plugins you build for desktop can be compiled to run on server. The scripts you write from desktop can be moved over to server. And it's really highly, highly overlapping. The thing, of course, as Mike noted, is that InDesign does not have a UI. It doesn't have a user interface. The desktop InDesign, InDesign Server does not. Desktop InDesign, of course, has the beautiful InDesign tool set that expert designers can use. InDesign Server is that engine itself, that raw composition engine, exposed to automation so that it can run in a very different way and be deployed differently. Like I said, it's automated in exactly the same way. Primarily, ExtendScript is probably the scripting language of choice, although others will work. And C++ plugins can be developed. ExtendScript tends to be the best practice for most things you're going to do with InDesign Server. So another way to look at it is how is it deployed? If you look at an InDesign deployment, it could be one or more authors working with desktop. They might share a file system, but they're not going to share the InDesign itself. InDesign is installed 5 times if you've got 5 users. In a server-based workflow, the server is really a back-end system, and it's a single system for all the users. And it does run multiple instances in parallel, but it's going to serve up either desktop applications or browser-based applications or mobile applications. It'll serve up content from requests from clients that are not InDesign itself. So that's one way to look at the difference. Maybe Brett can talk through the details, again, comparing InDesign to the server and what's different about it.
Yeah, and obviously, if you're a designer using InDesign, the keyboard shortcuts and the tools and the commands that you can use in InDesign itself to build a document. And that comes with a deep set of knowledge and expertise around how those tools work, how they interact, how one setting may cause problems with another, and that's the subject matter expertise that an InDesign user really builds over their course of their life with the application. And as Max was saying, everything is really set up to work on your machine, and that requires a lot of expertise and a lot of setup. But when you think about distributing to a larger workforce, folks who are not sophisticated designers, who have not worked with these kind of tools day in and day out, this is where you have the opportunity to simplify it and make it possible for code that they interface with through a web application or a mobile app that they fill out a few questions in a form, have that create the documents. And so the only person who needs to know how to set it up is the person administering the server. They set it all up, get it all running, and then give the end user a URL or an app to download to really drive how they use the app.
Briefly, why does it exist? Why would someone create InDesign Server? Oli's about to tell us how it came to be, but really it allows for coding things instead of typing them by hand, and that makes a lot of sense if you've got to create 300 product catalogs with different variations or update the data for a 2,000-page catalog. It is also the only way you can deploy a web-based solution using the InDesign engine. InDesign Desktop is not licensed for that, nor is it scalable for that. It's not made for that. People did that, and Oli will explain how, but it wasn't a good idea for several reasons. Beyond database publishing and web-based solutions, InDesign also can just offload the tasks that are tying up your desktop, making a PDF from an InDesign file. Maybe you have to make 4 different types of PDF from an InDesign file. That's the kind of thing you can offload from your InDesign workgroup. And again, the beauty of it is that it works with the InDesign document natively. You can load an InDesign document, you can save an InDesign document, and it does exactly what InDesign does. So it's a server version of the thing that is most commonly used for document creation on the desktop. And now we're going to talk about how it started. We have Oli himself on the phone, who was a part of its creation on the Adobe side. On the solution provider side, we were there begging for it and praying for it, but he was there when they finally got a request that made this application happen in 2005.
As I said, I was at Adobe working on InDesign scripting, and I'd created an online user forum and was just generally evangelizing InDesign automation. And InDesign was just starting to take off, and I got an email from someone who worked at a small brewery in upstate New York. This brewery would brew custom batches of beer for you and put custom labels on them, for your retirement, for a birthday, wedding party, what have you. And he really liked the InDesign scripting object model, so that was great. I love to hear that. And he'd set up a system where he could plug in, the things that the user wanted that were captured from the brewery's website and turn them into labels that would then be put on beer bottles. So What he wanted to know was, did his use, could he connect this to his website? Could he just have his website drive InDesign desktop to create these beer labels when he wasn't using it? And he wanted to know, would that violate the Adobe End User License Agreement? And I thought, well, probably, but I'll check around. So I checked around a bit and ended up in conversation with Adobe's chief corporate counsel. And he said, yes, it does violate the End User License Agreement, so they shouldn't do that. But I started arguing about why we should do that and how great a thing it would be to have an InDesign server. So it took quite a bit of internal argument to get to the point where we could do that. This was greatly assisted by the late Whitney McCleary, who was a wonderful person at Adobe who really did a lot of work to make this possible. We wanted to have a big button on websites that said "Powered by InDesign," and you'd click the button and get back a document. So it took quite a while. There was worry on the Adobe side that an InDesign server would hurt sales of InDesign Desktop. And I still think that's silly, because there are a whole lot of people who want the quality of output that you can get with InDesign without necessarily wanting to get the skills to get that output. And they're never going to buy desktop InDesign anyhow. So if we could give them a great way to get access to InDesign's composition engine, they could have great looking documents without needing to have InDesign itself. So anyway, that's where it started, and after quite a bit, we had InDesign Server, and that's why we're here today.
Thank you, Oli. And now we're going to drill into the meat of the presentation, which is how is it used today. And again, looking at the three main categories of use case, they're all they all can be divided into many subtle flavors of each one. So database publishing can happen for a parts company doing a parts catalog. It can be a one-to-one marketing thing for any marketing department. It can be a school report card. It could be a financial statement. So there's a broad range of that. Online editing also has use cases that cover the gamut, from a photo book editor to a greeting card maker to a book cover creator to something very simple where you're just filling in the data for a business card or passing a data set to a set of business cards. And then workgroup automation also can be very unique to different workgroups that are doing different things with InDesign and with the Adobe toolset. We're going to look mostly at database publishing. Database publishing is what brought us into it first, and it has probably the most diverse set of use cases you could imagine. This is a report from Gartner or someone like that outlining the range of database publishing opportunities out there. And it's one way to break down some classifications of database publishing. InDesign Server is found in all of these, and it's found in many more. So you can look at things that are very complex, that are usually lower volume, and you can look at things that are simpler and higher volume, and you get things that are somewhere in the middle. But it's a broad range of use cases, so I'm not going to look at all of them at once. I'm going to look at a few different ones one by one. First, just one-to-one marketing is a growing thing for InDesign Server, because InDesign Server goes faster every year as computers get faster and as the product evolves and as the cloud grows. So InDesign Server is now a viable product to render 1 million documents in a day. It wasn't always the case. And the kind of thing you can do is what's called trans-promo. So if you're sending out, if you're a mobile company sending out your phone bills, it doesn't have to just be a bill. It can be something of an advertisement. I think you can see some of this in today's communications. People can tailor it to what you bought, what you have, what they're trying to sell you, and they can pass in variable data. And then because it's the InDesign engine and it's got the InDesign exposure to automation, you'll notice that all three of these different documents, which came from a single template, end up filling the page. Well, how did that happen? It happened because the image was scaled properly given the white space available from the text, which was variable and might be a different shape for different recipients. And so InDesign can really accomplish very subtle output as if a designer did it, as if a designer made each one of the documents for the recipient. Another example is cruise booklets. Royal Caribbean has been running this solution for over 10 years, and they make their documents with it, and they're taking InDesign Server and passing in all of the information for each recipient. 10,000 unique recipients a day get this, and it tells them where they're going, who's going with them, all of that nuance. And this is passing through InDesign Server to render out to high-quality print output, or in the case of Royal, it also more commonly goes into a page flipping app or a document reader app, so it can leverage other outputs besides print. And getting away from print is ironically one of the things that InDesign Server can help you do. Looking at the workflow around database publishing, the desktop InDesign is used to create templates, and that can connect to DAMs and data sources if you're in an enterprise, or it can be all in your local file system if you're working locally. But basically, some kind of application, some pagination application. We have Paginator, which is ours, but this is the same workflow with most of the database publishing tools out there. The assets and the data merge with the templates, and that all runs through InDesign Server, often creating PDF output. Of course, it can also be images or anything that InDesign can emit, so it might not be PDF. In a more complex workflow, rules can come into play, and those rules can be from data. So you could have a list of the 300 variants of the catalog and parameters that control how those variants work. Or you could have a user enter and say, I want my own custom catalog. And those rules will be applied to the same process. The data, the assets, and the templates merge to render out usually high-quality PDF, but some form of graphic output. To look at database publishing in terms of how it's coded and how it's done, in a third scenario, consider financial statements, which are increasingly done with InDesign Server. InDesign has the best graphic capabilities of any tool, so it can render very high-quality output with visualization that's modern for this kind of document. And what a developer does, or what a tool does, to render this kind of output is it separates the content from the presentation. You might take the starting point template and break it into the components that are going to be used to ingest data and render for that specific output, for that specific plan for that year, or that fund for that year, or that quarter, or that day. The data is going to be separated from the presentation layer. And just looking at it component by component, you would isolate those components. It might be a single flow for some kinds of documents, but in this case, it's usually a bunch of different chunks of content. And you create what we call a data-ready snippet, or a section of the document where you're clear on what's the rendition intent and what's the data source. We break it apart so where you can feed data in. And that data could be XML, could be JSON, could be CSV, could be almost anything. And because we have a defined template for rendering that, all you have to do is run InDesign Server, and it can render out thousands of documents or millions of documents that express the merger of that data with the rendition intent. And this can be very subtle, as we saw with Royal, where it fits on the page no matter what. InDesign is a very, very highly evolved tool for automating the output. And when you code it to render output, you can really control it in a fine-grained way. And that's why it's really cool for database publishing. Brett or Oli, do you have anything to add?
Well, one thing for sure is that there's kind of a way of thinking around publishing that says that if you want high throughput automated publishing, then you don't really care about design, you don't care about color, and things like that. And I think this bias is way outdated at this point. We want database publishing with all of the best composition, the best image handling, the best color handling, and that's exactly what InDesign Server gives us. So we don't have to settle for bad-looking documents from automation anymore.
Great. The other major use case, as far as the solutions we build, is online editing, and that's become something of a focus for us since we built our first online editor in in the 90s, pre-InDesign, and then in 2005, when InDesign came out, one of our greatest obsessions was how can we make an editor that can edit that InDesign document from a web interface? And this is really a fun thing to do, and it's a fine art. And there are really two classes of online editing out there that are very different, and both are very powerful. But it's one of the gotchas to understand how InDesign can be used, and in the server capacity, how you can build solutions easily, and what kind of power they might have, and what the use case is, who's using it, and what are they trying to attain. And the two basic types of editing for online editing solutions with InDesign Server are form-based approaches, where you're typing in information in a very clean, clear way, with just the information passing on to the image in front of you. And this is the easy one. This is something that many companies can build themselves. Many developers can, even self-taught designers can build a solution like this with InDesign Server. So you're just passing data and images to a back-end process, and you come back with an image. So the form-based solutions are the easy ones. And it's a lot of bang for the buck, and in many cases, that's what you really want. So it's, I'll show you the hard one in a minute, but here's an example of a form-based InDesign Server solution. So it's the global fashion tour, but I'm in San Francisco, so I'll make it San Francisco. And when I tab out of the field, it's hitting the server and rendering an updated image. This is a dumb image coming from InDesign Server. It took the data in and changed the city for me, and in many cases, this alone is extremely powerful, and it's what you prefer to the complex case. Go ahead.
This, for example, would have been perfect for the brewery in upstate New York. That was all of the customization that they needed, was to be able to do just that. Yeah,
and it's worth even mentioning that, just as Max was talking about within the pagination use case, you know, this is very much the same kind of thing. It's you're feeding it a set of data and getting back a document, which also works really well if you're on a mobile device, because you know, you can fill out a quick form, you know, click a button and get back a PDF that you can then email to your customer.
Yes. So when we started this web to print stuff, we weren't doing much form-based because it was just too easy. We just tell you, just here's a basic script, do it yourself. And we were focused on the hard thing right away. So the fine art, the hard one, the difficult, challenging form of online editing is called WYSIWYG online editing, where you're actually creating the InDesign document in a browser in its entirety, which is something that is kind of hazardous to try on your own. We know that we have tire tracks at our back from doing this. So here I am on the canvas of this, and I'm going to type San Francisco. And voila, I'm seeing it as I type. I'm on the canvas. You know, it's a slippery slope. Once you get features like that, you might want drop shadows. You might want to change the stacking order of objects even. You know, I mean, you can take this for miles. I want this white triangle a little above the purple one. So I can work with the document, and this is entirely coming from InDesign, painstakingly rendered out to an intermediate format, and then it goes to the web browser, and then whatever edits I make here, I save back and publish, so I get a print output. So the WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, online editing is the hard one, and that's one of our specialties at Silicon Publishing, and it's something to be wary of. If you're trying to do that, you might want to get some help from somewhere. But this is how you do it. You have an intermediate format of some kind. And IDML is coming from InDesign itself, totally had a role in its creation. We have our own proprietary format called SDXML, but you want to take the InDesign document and express it in some way that can be rendered in HTML. And then you want to save that back and render out high-quality output from InDesign Server. So that's online editing on steroids, or the challenging use case. And it's not for everyone. It's when you really want that full creative control over the experience, and that, you know, ability to align objects or snap to grid, or all the things you might do in a browser that's somewhat simulating InDesign. Still, you're not going to attain InDesign on the browser. It's useful when you have sort of an intermediate case where it's easier than InDesign to use, but has some of the creative freedom. And Brett can speak to the third use case because he has deep experience, but automating the desktop workgroup is another great feature of InDesign.
Yeah, and this is, in many ways, something that Max has touched on in the other use cases, but it's where you put it all together. As I mentioned, my background starting with InDesign Server was in textbook publishing. And way back when I was implementing editorial workflow systems, and those are designed to allow collaboration between designers and contributors, whether they're photographers, illustrators, or writers and editors. And the classic kind of collaboration between that was InDesign and InCopy, where designers and editors are sharing documents with one another, and the changes the editor are making, they're able to see exactly how that fits in the layout, and when the designer opens up the layout, it has all of the content back into it. And where InDesign got started in that business, or InDesign Server got started in that business, was really around creating previews. Because if you're building a magazine or a newspaper or a book, you want to be able to call up a quick preview of that entire book coming together. And that may be 200 InDesign files, each with 50 pages in them, or that's probably a really large book, but several dozen InDesign documents with 10 to 20 pages in them. And so the first use for InDesign Server is creating thumbnails of all of those pages, previews. So right through a web browser, you can go in and see a overview of all the pages in all of these documents, maybe annotate them and mark them up. And this is something you see in workflow systems, in DAMs, you see them in tools like Adobe's Experience Manager. But where InDesign Server really became to and plays a key role in a lot of these systems is that it can automate the final output of that. If you think about creating these large documents and these large books, when it comes time to create those final PDFs, I don't want to have a user sit there and manually export them. I simply want to, set a status and have it go and grab each of those documents, creating single-page press-ready PDFs. A few versions ago in InDesign, that wasn't something you could do with InDesign out of the box. And so that really offloads that process, and then it can also be done by someone who doesn't even have InDesign themselves, a production manager or someone else who simply just says, I need these documents output. And then really the sort of the nexus of all of that is a lot like what we were talking about with a form-based editor, is actually the ability to edit the content of the InDesign document in a browser. And where this classically comes in is actually making it possible for that editor who might have previously used InCopy to work in a specialized application, whether that's a desktop app or an app delivered through a browser, where they can pull up the document, choose the content they want to edit, check it out, edit it, add paragraph and character styles, do any formatting, and then finally save that back to the server. And so that's where you see that in a lot of those work groups.
Okay, thanks, Brett. And then very briefly, we could go into this for a long time. We don't want to bore you to tears, but how is it automated? The beauty to us is that it's automated exactly like InDesign is automated. And we absolutely love InDesign scripting. It's something that's addictive. I warn you, if you start doing it, even if you're a terrible programmer like me, you'll get into it and start doing it. It's a really powerful tool. InDesign has incredible automation exposure to where anything you can do with the UI can be done in code, and it can be done perfectly every time. So here's a little script that Oli wrote, and it's actually a script to make graphics. This is going to make a pattern of some kind. And you can render graphics out by setting different parameters and passing them to the application. And it will do exactly what it's told every time. And it's amazing how these simple commands can actually create beautiful things and beautiful artwork. And it can also just keep going. And you can pass in the variable data that might change the shape of a pie piece in a pie chart, or you could change the generate graphs, you can put in text, you can put in images. You can really do anything you can imagine with scripting InDesign. And you script the desktop, and then you decide you like that script, and you put it on the server and run the same exact script in most cases. There are a couple subtle differences, but almost always it's really the same script running and rendering exactly the same. And so you can test it out with the desktop InDesign, make sure you've got what you want. And it's a very powerful tool, and I'd encourage everyone who hasn't tried scripting InDesign to script it. And that's really how it's automated in the real world in most cases. There is also a much more complex way, which is writing plugins in C++. And there are some downsides to that. Number one, it's hard. You need to be pretty much a computer scientist. That throws a lot of people out of the game. Also, it's brittle. You have to compile a plugin for each new version. If CC 2020 comes out, you've got to recompile for that. It's not as portable. So the time you build plugins is when scripting won't do the job or won't do it optimally for you. In general, everything you need to do with InDesign Server can be done extremely well with ExtendScript. So that's briefly how you automate it. Deploying it is also something we're not going to get into in exquisite detail, but you can deploy InDesign Server now in many different environments, in your own data center, on your raw metal server, in your virtual machine in your data center, in Amazon Cloud, in Microsoft Cloud, in Google Cloud. It can be deployed in any modern environment, and there is work to manage the multiple instances of InDesign Server and to scale. And we work very hard to create the scalability of it, because we work with people that do, on the order of 35,000 documents in a minute, or that sort of scale. And so we have a very robust tool of our own we call Nucleus, which manages a set of InDesign servers, runs them in parallel, and logs all the jobs with exquisite detail. And you can build your own system to administer InDesign Server, or you can come to someone like us or the other solution providers to have a ready-to-go scalability solution that can let you spawn as many instances in parallel as you want. It's really beautiful how it scales these days with the modern cloud environments especially. And the product has kept evolving, and the speed of computing has kept evolving, and cloud has kept evolving to the point where now InDesign Server is fairly infinitely scalable. You could imagine any load of documents and probably get it out of the server. How to try it, go to our blog. We have a how to try InDesign Server. We're just about to update now that 2020 is out today. There's a 90-day free trial with completely perfect, full-blown features, not a single feature missing. So you can try it and really deploy it and make sure it's the right thing for you before you buy it. Again, it's automated the same as desktop InDesign, so even before you try the server, you can write your scripts and run your scripts in InDesign Desktop, and if they work there, they're going to work on the server. How much does it cost? How do you buy it? Well, we're one of the resellers. I think you can buy it directly from Adobe or from the other resellers they list on their site. And there are two kinds of license. There is what's called a premium license, which is higher price. Premium is for those who use it in a web context or a browser-based context where you're sending a request and getting a response for a single document back on the web or outside of your firewall. The limited license is for things like rendering 1 million documents, like Royal Caribbean would use a limited license to render those cruise booklets, because it's all run behind their firewall as a big batch process where they press a button and 10,000 cruise booklets come out. And that's a limited license because it's really just for rendition inside of their organization. They do publish them out, but that's allowed. So you can ask us if you have any question as to which is which in your case. But those are the two prices, and we resell it, and so do many other companies out there. So I think that's it for the content, and we had tried to leave time for lots of questions.
Absolutely. So this first one is a really good question, Ole, for you. The question was, what version of JavaScript does InDesign Server support? They noticed that some JavaScript functions are not supported.
Sure. So the JavaScript is called ExtendScript. It's an Adobe flavor of JavaScript, and it's basically the same as the ECMAScript 5 spec. And so that's, ages ago in JavaScript development terms. So there are a lot of things that are missing, like, oh boy, where to start? Lots of neat array methods, for example, aren't present in ExtendScript. JSON isn't natively supported, though you can support it fairly easily. Stuff like that. Now, that only has to do with communicating with the InDesign model itself. In your web front end or database publishing backend, you can use modern V8 JavaScript, and in fact, it's used in another extensibility type for InDesign, which is CC extensions, which run in a little browser that's inside InDesign, and you can go back and forth between, say, the JavaScript V8 environment in a version of Chrome and go right to ExtendScript. So there are definitely some limitations when you're inside ExtendScript only, but there are usually ways to get around them by using higher level versions, newer versions of JavaScript, or for that matter, I mean, it's something that we touched on a bit but didn't really explicitly say is really any scripting or programming system that can connect with the platform's interapplication communication standard. It's COM in Windows. So in Windows you can use C#, you can use Visual Basic. You can use lots of different tools to get at the InDesign object model. Hope that made sense.
It does, and I think you really touch on something we do a lot of with our tools, which is you use the APIs that are available to you in InDesign, but you don't really let that stop you by leveraging our front end applications, our server applications, to do some of the heavy lifting to get it into the formats that InDesign needs it in. So that's great. So the next one, Max, has to do with a question, I think, when we were talking about pagination. Is there a way to dynamically add, remove, I think they're thinking about tables, so columns based on the data retrieved within a component in a template? Do you want to take this one, or shall I?
Yes. Yeah, you can take it, but yes, you can.
Yeah, and that's a really good example of the things we deal with when implementing an automation project. You're very often looking at the data coming in, trying to understand what the variability of is, and you can use that variability either to manipulate the document itself and add and remove columns like that, or simply, if the data coming in meets certain criteria, let's say it has 7 columns, things like that, you can have it bring in a different snippet, a different template altogether, and use that as the driving force of it as well. So, there's a lot of different ways that can be achieved, and a lot of that, how you solve that, is very often based on the customer needs.
Yeah, like an example comes to mind, which we see this removing columns happens quite a bit in parts catalogs, because parts in a parts catalog may not have the same schema at all for the important, for the different fields for that product. It might be a switch that has, impedance and volts and watts or whatever. It might be, a little piece of wood that has dimensions. And so we have flexible approaches to automating catalogs like that, where each page can have its own table with its own schema, and it's all rendered dynamically with code.
Fantastic. And then there was one other question I caught came in the chat, which was an interesting one. And this is going to be a jump ball for all of us. Can InDesign Server be used for making CNC files? And for those who aren't familiar with it, that's a woodworking tool set.
That's a question from a ringer in the audience. Vasily knows that I use InDesign to create what's called G-code files that drive computer-controlled routing machines and 3D printers and stuff as part of my music machine making hobby. So that was it's kind of a softball question to bring out a weird use of InDesign scripting. I mean, the main thing is that in talking to 3D formats, it's all just geometry. So you can read InDesign paths and output them as whatever 3D format you want. I also use it to create. I have scripts that look at InDesign files and then write Ruby scripts that can recreate the files in, for example, SketchUp. STL files are one that I haven't tried working with yet, but again, it's just geometry. So we have all the geometry in the InDesign document, and we can read it out to whatever format we want. Ideally, a text-based format, but it could be anything.
Yeah. So, Oli, are all your guitar robots built with InDesign?
Well, the parts start out often start out in InDesign. It's just I don't know if any of you have worked with actual 3D CAD tools, but what you find is that the user interface is maybe not as evolved as what you'd have in InDesign or Illustrator or another graphic arts program. So instead of starting out in those programs, I tend to start out in something I understand and then have a script that builds a bridge for me to those other programs.
Yeah, that's I always love hearing that story.
It's very nicely extensible.
Yeah, it's there are a lot of fun tools. I think I heard of one person who I know does InDesign scripting, building a plugin so that they could monitor their barbecue while working in InDesign. So one other question we got is InDesign Server considered just an engine to process with, or can it house data assets itself? This person is asking to see if there are efficiencies that can be gained in hosting things closer to InDesign Server. Max, I think this is something we've talked a lot about recently.
Yeah, we consult for companies that use InDesign Server, and we often just sell them the server, and they do amazing things. And sometimes they come to us and say, "Why is it so slow?" And we say, "No, it's not slow. You're probably doing something that's slow, but what are you using InDesign for, and what are you using other tools for?" And it's a very important thing to know when you're automating InDesign, no matter how great a programmer you are. It does one thing best. It renders output. It renders pages. It's not something where you want to put all of your data in there and sort it. It could do that. Using JavaScript, you can do anything you want, but should it do that? No, never. You really want to feed InDesign just what it needs to render and get out of there. That's what you do with InDesign. We had a company that was a fantastic set of programmers. They were geniuses. They built a beautiful, amazing system, far more elegant and object-oriented than anything we could ever code. And they came to us and said, "Why is it taking 15 days to run our 2,000-page catalog?" And we looked, and this beautiful code was sitting there parsing XML. They built a parser in JavaScript to parse the XML. It was sorting the data. It was rendering the whole thing in one big stream, all 2,000 pages. So no, you don't want to do everything with InDesign. It can house anything. It can do anything. You could keep a database in the InDesign server if you really, really wanted to. But you really want to have a layer of code outside of the application. Like we have our Silicon Paginator that does all the parsing, accesses all the modern data sources. We use MongoDB. We don't create a database inside of InDesign. We use the appropriate tool for the job. And InDesign is great at rendering output. And if you give it simple instructions to render something, it can go lightning fast. But you don't want to have it do everything. There are different tools for the job that will be different.
Perfect. Thank you, Max. And one last question. Mike, are you still on with us?
Yes, I am. I was on mute.
There was a question generally about animation in InDesign. I don't know if that's something you could talk to at all.
I mean, there are some limited interactive capabilities in InDesign. off the top of my head, I don't know how much you can really do with animation. We do support, I don't think this is quite the answer, but we now recently announced support for passing through SVG files in InDesign, not necessarily creating them in InDesign, but retaining them. And there are ways to pass through and kind of blend in animation. But it really depends on what you're trying to create in the end. You know,
Yeah, and I think,
not native.
Well, I have,
yeah, and Max pulled up a great example.
Leave it to the third parties, Mike. It does do animation, but someone has to do it. Justin Putney,
Right.
I think that's his name. He has an awesome HTML5 tool that does incredible animations from InDesign. And so, yeah, you can use InDesign to create very modern web-based animations. The SVG support, you know, SVG animation itself is kind of crippled by the various browser interactions. So I wouldn't think that, you know, necessarily SVG out of InDesign or into InDesign is going to be the greatest thing yet. But over time, you know, it's going to play nicer and nicer with standards, and the third parties are ahead of you with things that make it do amazing animation. So
Yep.
Yeah, I was gonna say the model, the InDesign scripting model, actually has a fairly rich set of animation support capabilities, but most of them were dedicated to running in Flash, which no one wants to use. So I would expect those to slowly migrate to, and I would expect those to migrate to SVG, though they're not there yet. And I believe that's what Justin's using to do his HTML5 animation. That he just
he does more than that. Yeah, it's I mean, yeah, he's really,
it's really incredible.
Pure HTML5 includes Canvas, SVG, CSS, and it's wonderful to see. It's kind of a myth that there's print or there's web. You know, and that the InDesign tool can apply to web really, really well. It might have even become the majority of its use right now. So it does work with animation if you know what you're doing and if you can control it.